Have you ever been made to feel invisible, even in a place where you paid for respect? Imagine sitting in first class, asking for something as simple as a cup of herbal tea, something you've enjoyed countless times before, only to be denied, dismissed, and mocked. What would you do? Stay silent and swallow the humiliation, or speak up, knowing the world might try to twist your voice against you? This is the moment Isaiah Cole, a black CEO, faced 30,000 feet above the ground. A man of quiet strength, forced into a choice no one should ever make except in dignity, or stand for something greater than himself. What if it had been you? How would you react if respect, so basic and so human, was treated like an upgrade you didn't deserve? This is not just a story about one man and one flight. It's about a question we all must face when dignity is denied. What will we do? Stay with me? Because what happened next didn't just change one flight. It shook an entire industry. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us bring stories that matter to light. The glass doors of Denver International Airport slid open as Isaiah Cole stepped out of his black SUV. The early morning air was thin and crisp, carrying the faint hum of planes lifting into the sky. Isaiah adjusted the cuff of his navy suit and straightened his shoulders. Every move he made seemed purposeful, controlled like a man who knew exactly who he was and how far he had come. At 45, Isaiah was not just another executive flying first class. He was the CEO of a powerful security and data firm that held government contracts across the country. He was a man who had built his empire through grit, intelligence, and the unshakable belief that dignity was not something to be granted, it was something to be claimed. Yet, despite the fortune, the accolades, and the power, Isaiah carried memories that refused to fade. He could still recall the days in his childhood when his mother was turned away from a cafe for asking to be served like everyone else. He remembered the sting of being told by a teacher that kids like him should not aim too high. Those memories lived inside him, quiet but sharp, shaping the man he had become. This morning, he was traveling to New York for an international economic summit where his voice was expected to set the tone for new policies. He needed calm, focus, and clarity. For Isaiah, that clarity always began with one simple ritual, a cup of herbal tea, brewed exactly the way he liked it. He walked through the polished terminal, nodding politely at the staff who recognized his presence. In the private security lane, the guard barely glanced at his ID before waving him through. Isaiah carried no entourage, no assistance with rolling bags. He preferred traveling alone, his calm demeanor his only armor. By the time he reached the gate, boarding for first class had already begun. Passengers in tailored suits and silk scarves lined up, some sneaking glances at him, others lost in their own hurried worlds. Isaiah stepped forward, handed his ticket to the agent, and felt the familiar tension in the air, the unspoken surprise of seeing a black man in a space most assumed was reserved for others. He said nothing, just offered a faint smile and walked onto the jet bridge. Inside the cabin, the glow of warm lights reflected against polished wood panels and crisp white linens. The air carried the subtle scent of leather mixed with freshly brewed coffee. Isaiah found his seat near the window, seat 2A, and placed his briefcase carefully under the seat in front of him. He adjusted the seat controls, leaning back into the plush comfort. For a moment, everything seemed aligned: the hum of the engines, the quiet shuffle of attendants preparing for takeoff, the promise of a smooth journey ahead. A young flight attendant passed by, smiling professionally. Isaiah raised his hand slightly. "Good morning," he said, his voice even and calm. Could I have a cup of chamomile with mint herbal, if you have it? That's usually what I take before a long meeting. The attendant nodded quickly, jotting something on her notepad. Of course, sir. I'll check right away. Isaiah leaned back, folding his hands over his lap. The request seemed small, almost ordinary. Yet, to him, it was more than a beverage. It was a ritual of grounding, a reminder that no matter the chaos of the world, he could begin with peace. As passengers settled into their seats, Isaiah glanced around. A middle-aged couple across the aisle whispered softly to each other. A young woman in business attire typed furiously on her laptop. The quiet luxury of first class was its own world, a place where appearances were polished and everything was designed to whisper comfort. But beneath the quiet surface, Isaiah sensed something else, a subtle energy, faint but present. He had felt it many times, before the way eyes lingered on him a second too long, the way voices shifted slightly when speaking to him. It was a familiarity he wished he could forget, but never could. A few minutes later, the attendant returned. This time, her steps felt heavier, her expression taut. She held a tray in her hands, but Isaiah noticed the steam rising from the cup. It wasn't tea. I'm sorry, Mr. Cole, she said softly, but we're out of the herbal tea you requested. Here's a cup of coffee instead. Isaiah looked at her, his eyes steady but questioning. Out of tea, he asked quietly. On a flight like this. The attendant hesitated, shifting her weight. Yes, sir. Only coffee this morning. He reached for the cup, careful not to let his disappointment show. But as the hot porcelain touched his hand, the faint aroma of bitter coffee filled his senses. It wasn't what he wanted. Not at all. He took a slow breath, controlling the ripple of irritation that threatened to rise. To anyone watching, it might have seemed trivial, just a cup of coffee instead of tea. But Isaiah knew better. He had lived long enough to recognize the difference between an accident and an attitude, between a shortage and a dismissal. He placed the cup gently on the tray table, his face unreadable. Outside the window, the sun was rising above the horizon, streaking the clouds with orange light. It was supposed to be the start of a smooth journey, but deep inside, Isaiah could already sense that this morning would test him in ways far beyond a missing cup of tea. The hum of the engines grew louder as the plane prepared for takeoff. Around him, the other passengers adjusted their seats, flipped through magazines, or closed their eyes. Isaiah remained still, his gaze fixed on the faint trail of light outside. What he didn't know yet was that in less than 10 minutes, the cup of coffee sitting in front of him would ignite a storm, not just in the cabin, but across the entire airline industry. The plane lifted smoothly into the sky, the pressure shifting slightly in the cabin as Denver disappeared below. Isaiah Cole sat back in his seat, his eyes half closed, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. He tried to focus on the summit ahead, on the presentation he had rehearsed in his mind a dozen times. But his thoughts kept circling back to the coffee cooling on his tray table. He wasn't angry yet, not outwardly. Years of boardroom battles and corporate negotiations had taught him patience, control, the art of waiting until the right moment. But inside, something stirred an unease he could neither ignore nor dismiss. He knew the difference between a mistake and a message, and the attendant's words replayed in his mind. We don't have your tea. Here's your coffee instead. 10 minutes into the flight, another attendant appeared. This one was different, taller, with neatly combed light brown hair and a posture that looked practiced but stiff. His name tag read Ethan Cross. He carried himself with the kind of smile that was meant to be polite, but landed closer to a smirk. Mr. Cole, Ethan said. setting a tray down with a clink. "I heard there was some confusion earlier. I brought you another cup." Isaiah glanced at the tray. It was the same thing, black coffee, steaming, its bitter scent cutting through the air. "I asked for tea," Isaiah said evenly. His tone was calm, measured, but his eyes were steady, piercing. Ethan shrugged lightly, as though brushing off the request. "Herbal tea isn't on our service list today. Coffee is more than sufficient. Most of our first-class passengers don't mind." The words landed like a stone in water, sending ripples through Isaiah's chest. Most of our passengers don't mind, as if his request was somehow unusual, excessive, or worse, unworthy. "I didn't ask about most passengers," Isaiah replied quietly. "I asked about mine." For a brief moment, their eyes locked. Ethan's held something Isaiah had seen before, a hint of coldness, the shadow of disdain that so often hid behind professionalism. It was fleeting, but undeniable. Ethan bent slightly to place the cup on Isaiah's table. His hand tilted the tray too far. In a blur, the hot coffee sloshed over the rim, spilling onto Isaiah's sleeve and splattering the fabric of his navy suit. The burn was sharp, sudden. Isaiah inhaled quickly, pulling back as the liquid seeped into the fine wool. Gas rippled through the cabin. Ethan muttered, "Oh, oops. My mistake." His voice flat, almost dismissive. Isaiah reached for the linen napkin, dabbing at the stain without looking up. His movements were slow, deliberate, like a man restraining an ocean behind a dam. Around him, passengers shifted in their seats, some glancing away to avoid the discomfort, others staring openly as if watching a silent confrontation unfold. "Mr. Cole, really, it was an accident," Ethan added, his tone laced with a thin thread of impatience. "No harm done." "Right." Isaiah finally lifted his eyes, meeting the attendant's gaze with a calm that was more unsettling than anger. "You spilled scalding coffee on a passenger and dismissed it as no harm done." The words were soft, but they carried weight. Ethan flinched slightly under the quiet intensity. Across the aisle, a woman's voice broke the silence. "That didn't look like an accident to me," said Linda Moore, a middle-aged passenger with silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears. She had been watching closely, her brows drawn tight with concern. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Ma'am, I assure you, it was unintentional." Linda didn't reply, but her eyes stayed on him, sharp and skeptical. Isaiah leaned back slowly, folding the napkin on the table. He took a deep breath, steadying himself, then spoke in a voice calm but edged with steel. "Get me your captain." Ethan blinked, taken aback. "Sir." There's no need for Isaiah cut him off with a single word. "Now." The command was quiet, but the authority behind it was unmistakable. It wasn't the raised voice of a frustrated traveler. It was the controlled tone of a man who had commanded boardrooms, negotiated billion-dollar contracts, and refused to let disrespect define him. Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the galley curtain, then back at Isaiah. For a moment, he seemed ready to argue. But something in Isaiah's unflinching gaze made him think better of it. Without another word, he turned and disappeared behind the curtain. The cabin was silent again. Passengers exchanged uneasy looks, the atmosphere thick with tension. Isaiah sat motionless, his hands resting on the armrests, his gaze fixed out the window at the endless stretch of blue sky. Inside, however, his thoughts churned. How many times must I endure this? How many times must I sit in spaces I paid for, earned, only to be reminded that to them I don't belong? He remembered his mother's voice from years ago, whispering to him after another incident at a restaurant one day. "Isaiah, they'll learn. You don't need to shout. Just stand. Just be." The memory steadied him, cooled the burn not just on his sleeve, but in his chest. Linda leaned slightly toward him, her voice low but firm. "Don't let them brush this aside," she said. "You deserve better." Isaiah turned his head, meeting her eyes. For the first time since the flight began, his expression softened. "Thank you," he said quietly. Moments later, the curtain parted. A man in a crisp Navy uniform stepped into the cabin. His cap was tucked under his arm, his expression professional but cautious. His name tag read Captain Michael Green. "Mr. Cole," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I understand there's been a concern." Isaiah straightened, his voice calm, unwavering. "Yes, Captain, there's been more than a concern. There's been a pattern, and I intend to address it." The cabin seemed to hold its breath. Every passenger, every attendant within earshot, felt the weight of the moment. It was no longer about a cup of tea or a spilled coffee. It was about something far larger, a question of dignity, of respect, of how one man would no longer allow himself to be dismissed. And though no one knew it yet, the decision Isaiah was about to make would not just change the course of the flight. It would change the course of the airline itself. Captain Michael Green stood in the aisle with the weight of authority stitched into every crease of his uniform. His eyes swept briefly over the cabin, sensing the tension that hung in the air like thick fog. He wasn't new to difficult passengers, but something about Isaiah Cole was different. This wasn't a man throwing a tantrum over champagne. This was a man who radiated calm power, the kind that demanded to be taken seriously. "Mr. Cole," the captain began, his voice steady, "I understand there's been a service issue. Allow me to extend my apologies. Our crew will ensure you're comfortable for the remainder of the flight." Isaiah looked up slowly, meeting Green's eyes. The faint reflection of the cabin lights glimmered in his calm but unyielding gaze. "Captain Green," he said softly, "comfort isn't the issue here. Respect is." The words, spoken with precision, seemed to cut through the hum of the engines. A few passengers shifted, their attention fixed entirely on the exchange. The captain cleared his throat, clearly hoping to diffuse the situation quickly. "I assure you, Mr. Cole, this will be addressed. Spills happen, but I'll have the attendant reprimanded. Let's move forward and enjoy the flight. Shall we?" Isaiah leaned forward slightly, folding his hands on the tray table. "Do you think I've come this far in life to be satisfied with a reprimand?" His tone was calm, but his voice carried an edge sharp enough to silence the row behind him. What happened here wasn't just a spill. It was a dismissal, a quiet way of telling me that my request, my presence, didn't matter. Green hesitated. He hadn't expected this passenger to frame it so clearly, so firmly. "Mr. Cole, if you'd like to file a complaint when we land, the airline has a process." Isaiah's voice cut in smoothly, deliberate and commanding. "I'm not talking about when we land. I'm talking about right now." The captain blinked, thrown off balance. "Right now." "Yes," Isaiah said, pulling a small leather folder from his briefcase. He opened it with deliberate care, revealing documents embossed with federal seals. "Do you recognize this? Captain Protocol 7 of the Aviation Security Partnership Act?" Green's eyes narrowed as he scanned the page Isaiah held up. His training told him what he was looking at was real and serious. The clause was obscure, rarely invoked, but it granted authority to reroute flights under very specific circumstances when a contracted federal security partner's dignity or safety had been compromised on board. "You're a federal partner?" Green asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with unease. Isaiah gave a small nod. "My company oversees security infrastructures for over a dozen major airports, including this airline's flagship hub. I didn't ask to use this authority today, but your crew has left me no choice." The captain's throat tightened. Around them, the cabin felt like it had frozen in time. Linda Moore leaned forward slightly, her eyes wide with both awe and solidarity. Even passengers who had been trying to pretend they weren't watching now stared openly. "Mr. Cole," Green said carefully, "what exactly are you requesting?" Isaiah's reply was simple, but it carried the force of inevitability. "Change the route." The silence that followed was suffocating. A child somewhere in the back whimpered. The sound of the engines thrummed louder, filling the space that words had vacated. Green's jaw clenched. He had been flying for 20 years, and never once had he diverted a flight for something like this. Diversions cost millions, disrupted schedules, and rattled reputations. But as he looked at Isaiah, calm, unflinching, holding both the legal authority and the moral high ground, Green realized he was cornered. The man in front of him wasn't bluffing. "Sir," the captain said at last, his voice stiff, "changing course would cause significant disruption. I need to know why this action is necessary." Isaiah's gaze hardened. "Because respect isn't optional. Captain, it's the foundation of safety. A crew that dismisses and humiliates a paying passenger demonstrates a failure of discipline and culture. And if they can dismiss me, a partner whose name is written into your contracts, then what does that say about how they treat everyone else?" The words landed like a gavel. Green exhaled slowly, his shoulders sinking under the weight of the moment. He knew Isaiah was right. The eyes of the passengers bore into him, waiting for a decision. Finally, he nodded. "Understood. I'll notify the control tower and initiate a diversion to Chicago O'Hare." The murmur that rippled through the cabin was instant. Some passengers whispered in disbelief. Others sat in stunned silence. Ethan Cross reemerged from behind the curtain, his face paling as he realized the gravity of what was happening. The very man he had dismissed was now redirecting an aircraft mid-flight. Isaiah leaned back in his seat, his movements unhurried. He didn't smile, didn't gloat. Instead, he closed the folder and slipped it back into his briefcase. His voice, when he finally spoke again, was calm as ever. "Thank you, Captain. That'll be all." Green gave a curt nod and walked briskly back toward the cockpit. The cabin remained tense, charged with an energy that was both fearful and admiring. Linda leaned closer again, her voice hushed but firm. "I've flown for 30 years, she whispered, "and I've never seen anything like that. You didn't raise your voice once, and yet—" She shook her head in disbelief. Isaiah glanced at her, his expression unreadable. Sometimes power isn't in volume, it's in precision. Ethan passed by quickly, avoiding eye contact as he retreated to the galley. Isaiah didn't watch him. Instead, he reached for a fresh napkin, methodically pressing it against the damp stain on his sleeve. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled, but his mind was alive with thoughts that would not rest. Was this what it would always be, to earn every seat, every ounce of respect, only to have it threatened by a moment of carelessness or cruelty? Was every small indignity just a reminder of a larger truth that to some he would never belong? The questions swirled, but Isaiah pushed them aside. He had made his choice, And the course of the flight was already changing. Not just the physical course, but the moral one. What had started with a cup of tea had become a test of principle, and Isaiah had refused to back down. The intercom crackled. Captain Green's voice, carefully composed, filled the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. Due to operational needs, we'll be making a minor adjustment to our flight path and will be landing briefly in Chicago before continuing to New York. We appreciate your understanding." It was a cover story, one the airline would cling to. But every passenger in that cabin knew the truth. Isaiah's fingers tapped softly on the armrest, his gaze steady on the horizon. The plane had changed its route, but the deeper shift, the one inside the hearts and minds of those who witnessed it, was only just beginning. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft steadied into its new path. For a few moments, silence dominated, heavy and unspoken, broken only by the steady drone of the engines. Isaiah Cole sat upright, his hands folded on his lap, his gaze fixed out the window where streaks of sunlight cut across the endless sky. To anyone else, he looked serene, but inside, he was anything but. He had just compelled a captain to reroute an entire flight. That kind of decision was monumental, costing time, money, and reputation. He hadn't done it out of ego or for a spectacle. He had done it because of principle, because he knew the quiet humiliation he endured was the same humiliation countless others faced without the voice or power to fight back. Across the aisle, Linda Moore was still watching him, her expression a mixture of astonishment and quiet admiration. Passengers whispered among themselves in subdued voices, glancing toward Isaiah like he was no longer just another traveler, but something larger, a symbol of defiance against a system that too often silenced those it didn't value. Ethan Cross reappeared from the galley, his steps uncertain now. The arrogance he wore earlier had vanished, replaced by a nervous stiffness. He avoided Isaiah's eyes, moving quickly down the aisle to check on other passengers, but his presence only stirred more unease. The cabin had shifted. The authority no longer rested solely in uniforms and polished smiles. It belonged to the man in Seat 2A. Isaiah kept his expression neutral, but his thoughts ran deep. He remembered a phrase his father used to repeat: "The smallest insult can reveal the largest cracks." That morning, a simple cup of tea, or the lack of it, had cracked open the polished surface of the airline's culture. What lay beneath was what he had always known existed: carelessness, arrogance, and a disregard for certain passengers who didn't fit the mold. The murmurs grew louder. A man in his 50s leaned toward his wife, whispering, "Can you believe this? He made them change the route." His wife, glancing at Isaiah, replied softly, "Maybe it's about time someone did." Linda finally broke the silence between herself and Isaiah. "You know," she said, her voice low but steady. Most people would have just swallowed it, taken the coffee, smiled, and let it go. "You didn't." Isaiah turned his head, his expression softening slightly. "Too many times. Silence is mistaken for acceptance. If I let it pass, it would only happen again to me. To you, to anyone they thought wouldn't speak up." Her lips curved into a faint smile. "Then I'm glad you did." The curtain at the front of the cabin rustled, and two men stepped through. Their appearance drew immediate attention. They weren't crew. Their suits were sharp, their demeanor corporate. Isaiah recognized them instantly. Executives, the very sort of people who usually stayed behind boardroom doors, not inside the pressurized tension of a diverted aircraft. One of them, tall with thinning blonde hair, introduced himself in a clipped tone. "Mr. Cole, I'm Richard Hale. Senior Vice President of Operations. This is Mark Leland, our Head of Customer Relations. We were already en route to New York, but obviously this flight has changed course. Isaiah studied them, his face unreadable. So I see. Hale cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable under the watchful eyes of the other passengers. We'd like to discuss what happened. Perhaps we can reach an understanding. Isaiah didn't answer immediately. He let the silence linger, heavy, deliberate. The cabin seemed to lean toward him, waiting. Finally, he spoke. The understanding is simple. Respect isn't negotiable. Hale shifted uneasily, unused to being challenged so directly, especially in public. Of course, but surely a diversion isn't necessary. Isaiah cut in, his tone calm but final. It's already done. The words landed with such certainty that even Hale stopped mid-sentence. The executives exchanged a glance, both realizing this was no ordinary passenger they were dealing with. Meanwhile, further down the cabin, phones had begun to glow. Passengers discreetly typed messages, some even snapping blurred photos. The story was already escaping the cabin walls, flowing into the digital world where hashtags and headlines would soon ignite. Isaiah noticed, but he didn't stop them. In fact, part of him welcomed it. The truth wasn't something to be hidden. It was something to be witnessed. The intercom chimed again. Captain Green's voice, clipped but professional, came through. Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing at Chicago O'Hare within the hour. Please remain seated and follow crew instructions. We appreciate your patience. But there was no patience in the cabin now. There was tension, curiosity, and a growing awareness that they were part of something bigger than an inconvenience. They were witnessing the unraveling of an airline's veneer, pulled apart not by shouting or chaos, but by one man's quiet refusal to be disrespected. Isaiah shifted in his seat, reaching for his phone. He opened a secure channel, his fingers moving with practiced precision. Within seconds, his assistant answered. Yeah, Kerr, came the voice on the other end. Prepare a formal complaint, Isaiah said quietly. Not just about the service, about the systemic disregard I've witnessed. I want the language sharp, the evidence clear, and I want it on the CEO's desk before this plane touches down. Yes, sir. Understood. Isaiah ended the call, slipping the phone back into his pocket. His mind was already calculating, strategizing. This wasn't just about an apology or free voucher. This was about forcing change. The coffee stain on his sleeve had dried into a dark patch, stark against the fine wool. He looked at it for a moment, almost contemplatively. That stain would wash out, but the deeper stain, the one left by arrogance and dismissal, wouldn't fade unless it was confronted. As the plane continued toward Chicago, the energy in the cabin shifted again. Respect wasn't being demanded through volume or threats. It was being commanded by presence, by authority quietly asserted. Isaiah knew this was only the beginning. The real storm would come after they landed, when the airline tried to contain the narrative, when executives scrambled to cover their missteps, and he would be ready. By the time the skyline of Chicago appeared faintly in the distance, a sense of inevitability had settled over the cabin. The passengers were restless, the crew tense, the executives sweating under their polished collars. And Isaiah Cole sat calmly, a man who knew that sometimes the smallest act of defiance could change not only the course of a flight, but the course of an entire industry. The descent into Chicago was announced with the usual mechanical calm of the intercom, but nothing about the cabin felt routine. Seat belts clicked into place, window shades shifted, And yet no one's mind was on safety demonstrations. Every passenger was attuned to the undercurrent, to the knowledge that they were arriving not at their intended destination, but at the epicenter of a storm. Isaiah Cole sat motionless as the plane dipped through layers of cloud, the skyline of Chicago emerging faintly beneath a haze. He watched the grid of streets stretch outward, the lake shimmering in the distance. His breathing was steady, though inside, he prepared himself for the next stage. The diversion was only the opening act. What came after exposure, accountability, reform would be the real test. Beside him, Linda Moore leaned toward the window, her eyes wide. "I've flown into O'Hare dozens of times," she whispered, "but this feels different, like the city is waiting for something." Isaiah gave a small nod. "Sometimes the ground knows before we do." The wheels met the runway with a jarring thud. Brakes screeched, the engines roared in reverse, and the cabin rocked forward in unison. As the aircraft slowed, an uneasy silence fell again. No applause, no chatter, only the awareness that they had arrived at a crossroads. The plane taxied to a remote gate, far from the usual bustle of the terminal. Passengers craned their necks to see out the windows, and murmurs rose as they spotted a convoy of vehicles waiting on the tarmac. Not just fuel trucks or baggage carts. SUVs, official sedans, and 2 vans marked with the insignia of the Federal Aviation Administration. Ethan Cross stiffened in the aisle, his knuckles white on the beverage cart he hadn't touched in nearly an hour. Captain Green's voice returned over the speakers, clipped and professional. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Federal inspectors will be boarding shortly. We appreciate your cooperation." The gasp that swept through the cabin was electric. Inspectors. This wasn't routine anymore. This was an intervention. The doors opened, and a wave of crisp autumn air spilled inside. 3 inspectors boarded first, their dark suits and badges gleaming under the cabin lights. Behind them followed airport security, their presence firm but non-threatening. The late inspector, a woman with steel-gray hair and a sharp gaze, introduced herself as Marianne Torres, senior investigator for the FAA. Her voice carried the authority of someone used to cutting through excuses. "We've received notice of a compliance incident on board this flight. We'll need to speak with the captain, the crew, and certain passengers." Her eyes scanned the cabin until they landed on Isaiah. "Mr. Cole, if you'll come with us." The words sent another ripple through the cabin. Isaiah rose slowly, gathering his briefcase. Every movement was deliberate, steady. He wasn't a man being escorted out in shame. He was a man walking towards something larger than himself. Linda touched his arm lightly as he passed. "We'll be watching," she said. Her eyes held both gratitude and hope. Isaiah gave her a faint smile before stepping into the aisle. The inspectors parted the way, guiding him toward the exit. Passengers turned their phones discreetly, recording, snapping pictures. Within minutes, the images would flood social media. A black CEO, calm and composed, flanked by federal investigators as an airline crew fidgeted in their seats. On the tarmac, the wind tugged at Isaiah's suit as he was led toward a temporary operations tent set up beside the convoy. Inside, the air buzzed with tension. Captain Green stood rigidly near a table, his cap under his arm. Ethan Cross lingered in the background, pale and visibly sweating. Richard Hale and Mark Leland, the executives who had boarded mid-flight, were already inside, their polished confidence cracking under the scrutiny of federal oversight. Marianne Torres gestured for Isaiah to take a seat across from her. She placed a recorder on the table and pressed a button. "Mr. Cole, please describe what occurred from your perspective." Isaiah's voice was steady. every word precise. He recounted the denial of his request, the dismissive tone, the deliberate spill of coffee, and the subsequent refusal to treat the incident with respect. He spoke not with anger, but with clarity, painting a picture that revealed the deeper issue, a culture that saw certain passengers as less deserving of dignity. Torres listened intently, her pen scratching across the page. When he finished, she nodded once. "Thank you. Mr. Cole, we'll be corroborating your account with passenger statements. Several have already come forward." She turned to Hale and Leland. "And we'll also be reviewing your crew's records for prior complaints." Ethan opened his mouth as if to speak, but Hale shot him a warning glance. The attendant's lips pressed shut again. Isaiah leaned back, his eyes calm but sharp. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone who's been dismissed in silence. I don't need compensation. I need accountability. I need to know that the next person won't be treated the way I was." His words hung in the air, heavier than the whir of the portable heaters keeping the tent warm. Hale shifted uncomfortably, but Torres didn't let the silence stretch long. "Mr. Cole, you have my assurance that this will be investigated fully. And I'll tell you now, we've already found cause for concern." Back in the terminal, passengers had been escorted off the plane in small groups. Many stopped to speak with reporters who had already gathered outside security checkpoints, tipped off by social media posts. By the time Isaiah stepped out of the tent, escorted not as a suspect, but as a witness, news vans lined the perimeter fence, cameras flashed, microphones jutted forward, and voices called his name. "Mr. Cole, is it true you forced the plane to land? Were you denied service because of your race? What do you want the airline to do now?" Isaiah paused, the cameras reflecting in his calm eyes. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't deliver a speech rehearsed for drama. Instead, he spoke the truth in its simplest form. "All I wanted was a cup of tea," he said softly, "and to be treated with respect. What I received was neither. This is not just about me. It's about a system that must change, and today is where that change begins." The microphones quivered in the air as reporters scrambled to capture his words. Behind him, Hale and Leland lingered, their faces pale, their company's future already slipping through their grasp. Isaiah walked past the cameras with steady steps, his figure framed against the backdrop of the aircraft he had forced to reroute. For those who watch passengers, reporters, viewers at home, he wasn't just a man in a suit. He was a mirror, reflecting back the reality too many knew, but too few could confront. And as the footage spread across networks and screens, a narrative began to take shape. It wasn't about a beverage. It wasn't about a single flight. It was about power, dignity, and the refusal to be silenced. By the time Isaiah Cole left the perimeter of O'Hare, the story was no longer contained to one diverted flight. It had exploded outward, carried by passengers' posts, by shaky videos shot on phones, by journalists who sensed the gravity of what had unfolded. Hashtags began trending within the hour. Respect in the skies. Colv's Airline. Dignity is non-negotiable. Isaiah's assistant, waiting in the car that whisked him away from the terminal, handed him a tablet with live feeds of the coverage. Clips of him speaking outside the tent played in an endless loop. The phrase, "All I wanted was a cup of tea," and respect scrolled across the bottom of the screen as commentators debated what it meant for the airline industry, for corporate accountability, and for the culture of service itself. But Isaiah wasn't watching for fame or applause. He studied the footage like a strategist reviewing a battle map. Every angle, every replay, confirmed what he already knew. This was no longer just about him. It had become a catalyst. At the airline's headquarters in New York, boardroom lights burned late into the night. A crisis meeting had been called by Jonathan Reeves, the CEO himself. Reeves was known as a man who prided himself on control, on polished statements and carefully choreographed appearances. But now, as he sat at the head of a long mahogany table, his usually composed demeanor was cracking. "We've lost 15% of market value in one day," Reeves said, his voice tight. "Investors are demanding answers. Our inbox is flooded with demands for accountability. We cannot afford for this to spiral further." Richard Hale and Mark Leland, both looking weary from their encounter in Chicago, shifted uneasily in their seats. Hale tried to speak. "Jonathan, this was an isolated incident, a difficult passenger, an overreaction." Reeves slammed his hand on the table, startling the room. "Do not insult me. Richard, I've seen the footage. That was no overreaction. That was a man who exercised more restraint and dignity than any of us sitting here." The room went silent. Reeves exhaled sharply and leaned back. "We have two options. We try to spin this as a mistake, a misunderstanding, or we face it head-on and change." No one answered. They all knew the first option was a dead end. The world had seen too much. Meanwhile, Isaiah sat in his hotel room in downtown Chicago, his suit jacket draped over the back of a chair. The city lights glittered outside, but his mind was fixed inward. His phone buzzed constantly with messages, congratulations, outrage, support. Some were from strangers, others from leaders he knew personally. But the one that gave him pause was from a name he hadn't expected: Jonathan Reeves. The message was simple. "We need to meet. Tomorrow morning. Headquarters. I'll send a car." Isaiah stared at the screen, weighing it. He knew what Reeves wanted: damage control, some negotiation that would soften the blow. But Isaiah wasn't interested in quiet settlements. He was interested in systemic change. The next morning, as dawn spilled over Manhattan, Isaiah arrived at the headquarters. The glass tower gleamed. But inside, the atmosphere was heavy, almost suffocating. Employees lined the lobby, their eyes flicking toward him with a mixture of curiosity and unease. Some nodded subtly, as if silently rooting for him. Others looked away, fearful of what his presence represented. He was led to the top floor, where Reeves awaited in the executive boardroom. The CEO rose as Isaiah entered, extending a hand. "Mr. Cole," Reeves said, his voice polished but strained. "Thank you for coming." Isaiah shook his hand firmly, his gaze unwavering. "Let's not waste time." Reeves gestured to the table, where Hale, Leland, and several other executives sat. A few avoided Isaiah's eyes, their guilt written plainly across their faces. "Mr. Cole," Reeves began, "this company deeply regrets the incident you endured. On behalf of the board, I extend our sincerest apologies." Isaiah's expression didn't change. Apologies without change are empty. "What are you prepared to do?" The question landed with force. Reeves hesitated, glancing at his executives before speaking. "We are prepared to remove the employees involved," Isaiah interrupted, his tone calm but unyielding. "This isn't about scapegoats. Fire one attendant, suspend another, and the culture remains the same. I want systemic reform, transparent accountability, a shift in how you treat every passenger, not just me." The room stirred uncomfortably. Hale leaned forward, his voice sharp. "With respect, Mr. Cole, you're asking for too much. No single passenger dictates corporate policy." Isaiah turned his gaze on him, steady and piercing, I'm not just a passenger. I'm a partner in your infrastructure contracts. My company secures the very systems that keep your planes flying. And more than that, his voice softened, but the edge remained. I'm a man who refuses to be disrespected. If you think my demands are too much, wait until you see the demands of the public watching you now. Reeves raised a hand, silencing Hale. What exactly are you asking for? Mr. Cole Isaiah unfolded a document he had prepared overnight. His assistant had worked through the night to put it together, every word precise, every clause enforceable. He slid it across the table. The executives leaned in. The title read, Passenger Dignity Protocol. Isaiah explained it point by point. Independent oversight of passenger complaints, mandatory bias and de-escalation training for all crew, transparent reporting of incidents, an advisory council with independent members, including himself, to ensure accountability. And finally, Isaiah said, his voice low but firm, public acknowledgement of what happened. Not a statement buried on your website, a press conference, in front of the world. The room fell silent. Reeves studied Isaiah, his jaw tight, his mind calculating. He knew this wasn't just about saving the company's image. It was about survival, refuse, and the airline risked collapse under the weight of public outrage. Except, and they might salvage not only their reputation, but their future. At last. Reeves nodded slowly. Very well. We'll do it. Isaiah inclined his head slightly. Then we have an understanding. The meeting adjourned with heavy silence, the executives dispersing like shadows. Isaiah remained seated for a moment longer, his eyes fixed on the skyline outside the tall windows. He hadn't sought power in this, but he had wielded it because he had to, because every time dignity was denied, it demanded someone to stand, to resist, to insist on something better. And as he left the building, reporters crowded outside, microphones thrust forward. Isaiah paused, lifting his head, and spoke the words that would echo beyond that morning. This isn't the end of a story. It's the beginning of a standard. Respect will no longer be optional in the skies. The crowd erupted with questions, but Isaiah walked calmly past, his steps deliberate, his presence unshaken. The storm had begun, but so had the change. The press conference was scheduled for noon, but by 10 o'clock, the plaza outside the airline's headquarters was already overflowing. Reporters jostled for space, cameras lined the barricades, and citizens from across the city held signs that read, Respect is a right, dignity at 30,000 feet, and simply, Isaiah. The hum of anticipation was electric, the kind that meant history was about to be made, inside. Isaiah Cole adjusted his tie in the green room. His assistant, a quiet young man named Julian, stood nearby with a notepad, occasionally glancing at the live feed on his tablet. The screen showed the sea of faces outside, waiting. Isaiah's reflection in the mirror was steady, composed, but beneath the calm exterior, his heart carried the weight of millions who had been dismissed, humiliated, or silenced in ways the world never saw. Jonathan Reeves entered the room, his usually perfect composure now tempered with humility. Mr. Cole, he said, voice even, I want to thank you for standing here with us today. I know you don't need to. Isaiah turned from the mirror, his gaze unwavering. I'm not standing for you. Jonathan, I'm standing for the people watching. Remember that. Reeves nodded. There was no room left for ego. He gestured toward the door. It's time. They stepped into the blinding light of the press hall. The stage was set with two podiums, the airline's logo flanked by American flags. The audience erupted with shouts and flashes as the two men walked to the front. Reeves took the first podium, clearing his throat. His voice amplified across the plaza. "Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Reeves, CEO of Continental Atlantic Airlines. We are here today because of an incident that has shaken not only our company, but the very trust of the passengers we serve. What happened to Mr. Isaiah Cole aboard Flight 217 was unacceptable. It was not only a failure of service, but a failure of respect and humanity. For that, we take full responsibility." The crowd stirred, some skeptical, some listening intently. Reeves paused, then gestured toward Isaiah. "But this moment is not about me. It's about the man who chose not to stay silent. Mr. Cole." Isaiah stepped forward. The room hushed as his deep voice filled the space. "Thank you. Let me be clear. I didn't want to be here under these circumstances. I didn't want a flight attendant's mistake to become a headline, or for a company's failure to become a scandal. But sometimes, life doesn't give you what you want. It gives you what you must face." He let the silence hang, every eye fixed on him. "On that flight, I asked for something simple, a cup of tea. What I received instead was not just hot coffee spilled on my suit, but an attitude that said, 'You don't matter. You don't belong here.' And I realized something. If this could happen to me, a man with power, with resources, imagine what happens daily to those without." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Isaiah continued, his tone steady but charged with emotion. "This isn't just about me. This is about every passenger who has ever been ignored, dismissed, or treated as less than. It's about every person who's ever been told, directly or indirectly, that their dignity is negotiable. Let me tell you, it is not." Cameras flashed. Pens scribbled furiously. Isaiah reached into his jacket and held up a single page. "This is the Passenger Dignity Protocol. Starting today, this airline commits to independent oversight, mandatory training, transparent reporting, and an advisory council to hold them accountable. But more than that, it's a promise that dignity will not be an upgrade. It will be the standard." The crowd erupted, reporters shouting questions, flashes illuminating the stage like lightning. Reeves looked almost relieved, though the weight of what had just been committed to was monumental. Isaiah folded the page and placed it on the podium. "This is not the end. It's the beginning of a movement, because respect in the skies should not depend on who you are, the color of your skin, or the size of your wallet. It should be as simple as breathing." The applause that followed wasn't just from the press, but from employees who had slipped into the back of the hall, flight attendants and staff who had quietly endured the toxic culture for years. Some had tears in their eyes. Later, outside, Isaiah found himself surrounded by microphones again. A reporter from CNN asked, "Mr. Cole, do you forgive the people involved?" Isaiah paused, his gaze thoughtful. Forgiveness is not the same as forgetting. Those individuals will face consequences, as they should. But my focus isn't on punishing them. It's on changing the system that allowed it. Forgiveness, for me, is making sure this doesn't happen again. That night, the clip of Isaiah saying dignity will not be an upgrade. It will be the standard went viral. It was replayed on news broadcasts, shared on social media, and quoted by columnists. Hashtags turned into movements. Former flight attendants came forward with stories. Passengers shared their own humiliations. It wasn't just one man's stand anymore. It was everyone's. At home in Chicago. Isaiah sat quietly by the window of his apartment, the city stretching out beneath him. The lights shimmered like a living sea. He thought about his father, who had once been escorted off a flight for suspicious behavior simply because he was a black man traveling alone. His father had never raised his voice, never fought back. But Isaiah remembered the look in his eyes afterward, a mix of humiliation and quiet resignation. Isaiah whispered softly to himself, "Not anymore. Dad, not anymore." His phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Marianne Torres, the FAA investigator. "Your protocol is under review for adoption beyond this airline. Industry-wide reforms may be next. We'll keep you posted." Isaiah allowed himself a rare smile. It wasn't victory yet, but it was momentum. And sometimes, momentum was all it took to start a revolution. The morning after the press conference, headlines blared across every major network. Dignity Protocol announced after CEO's viral flight incident. Isaiah Cole forces airline to face systemic racism. Talk shows replayed the speech. Analysts dissected every phrase. And ordinary people debated it over breakfast tables and office coffee stations. What had once been a humiliating moment aboard Flight 217 had become a national conversation about dignity, power, and the quiet ways discrimination showed itself in daily life. In Washington, a group of senators gathered in a closed-door meeting. One of them, Senator Claire Whitmore of Illinois, set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. "We can't ignore this," she said, her tone brisk. "If one CEO can force a corporation to change overnight, imagine what federal oversight could do for the entire industry." Another senator, older and more cautious, frowned. "Careful. Claire, the airline lobby is powerful. They'll push back." Whitmore leaned forward. "Then let them. Public opinion is shifting fast. If we don't act, we'll be the ones left behind." Meanwhile, in Atlanta, a retired school teacher named Ruth Johnson scrolled through her phone, tears filling her eyes as she watched Isaiah's speech. She remembered a flight from years ago when she had been asked to move to the back so a preferred passenger could sit in her assigned seat. She had never told anyone, not even her children. Now, seeing Isaiah speak the words she had carried in silence for decades, she whispered, "Finally." She opened her laptop and wrote her story on social media. Within hours, it was shared thousands of times. Isaiah, back in Chicago, was flooded with messages. His assistant Julian brought him a stack of printed emails and letters. Each morning, stories of passengers who had been overlooked, demeaned, or outright mistreated. Some were about race, others about class, disability, or simply arrogance. Isaiah read them late into the night, his heart heavy but resolute. These weren't just stories, they were fuel for the fire that had already been lit. Not everyone, however, was celebrating. Inside Continental Atlantic Airlines, tensions ran high. Richard Hale and Mark Leland, both publicly quiet since the press conference, met privately with a handful of loyal executives. Reeves has handed the company over to him. Hale fumed, slamming a fist against the table. "Cole is dictating policy now. He's not even on our payroll." Leland's voice was lower, cautious. "Be careful. Richard, the board is siding with him. Investors see him as a stabilizing force, not a threat." But Hale shook his head. "He's making us look weak. If we let this stand, every passenger with a grievance will think they can rewrite the rules." His words carried an edge of desperation. Beneath his anger was fear. Fear that the old way of doing things was collapsing, and with it, the power he had clung to for decades. Outside the corporate walls, the ripple effect grew stronger. Other airlines released statements, some vague and others direct, pledging to review their own policies. Activists began organizing under the banner, "Dignity in Transit," demanding reforms not only in airlines but in buses, trains, and even rideshare services. What began as one man's protest was spreading into a broader movement about respect in all forms of public travel. Isaiah watched it all unfold with a quiet intensity. He met privately with Marianne Torres, the FAA investigator, in a small cafe in Chicago's West Loop. Marianne leaned across the table, her eyes sharp. "The agency is reviewing your protocol. If we adapt it federally, it could change not just one airline, but the entire industry. But you need to understand, this will put you in the crosshairs. Airline executives, lobbyists, even politicians who benefit from their donations, they won't forgive you for forcing their hand." Isaiah stirred his tea slowly, his expression calm. "I didn't step into this to be forgiven. I stepped into it because I was disrespected in a way that millions of others are, every single day. If I have to carry the weight of their anger to bring change, so be it." Marianne studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then you need allies. This can't just be about you. Build a coalition. Bring in voices they can't ignore." That night, Isaiah called Linda Moore, the passenger who had spoken up for him on Flight 217. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm but surprised. "Mr. Cole, Isaiah, please," he corrected gently. "I wanted to thank you again. You spoke up when others stayed quiet. That matters." Linda hesitated. "I just did what was right." "That's exactly why I'm calling," Isaiah said. "I want you to join the Advisory Council for the Dignity Protocol, not as a corporate figure, but as the voice of ordinary passengers. People will listen to you in ways they won't listen to me." There was silence on the line, and then Linda's voice, steady but tinged with emotion. "If it means no one else has to go through what you did, or worse, then yes. I'll do it." As the days passed, Isaiah began assembling a team: Linda as the passenger advocate, Marianne as the federal liaison, Julian coordinating logistics, and a growing number of allies from civil rights groups, unions, and community organizations. Each meeting added momentum. Each story added urgency. Still, the resistance hardened. Anonymous op-eds began appearing in business journals, painting Isaiah as a power-hungry CEO leveraging race for influence. Talk radio hosts mocked him, saying, "It's just tea." He wanted attention. Isaiah read them all, not with anger, but with clarity. He knew these voices were the last gasp of a system desperate to protect itself. Then came the twist. One evening, Julian rushed into Isaiah's office, his face pale. He handed over a folder. Inside were leaked documents, internal memos from Continental Atlantic executives discussing profiling upgrades, a quiet policy of flagging certain passengers as low-priority service based on subjective criteria. Criteria that, Isaiah realized with a sinking feeling, often meant race, appearance, or perceived status. Isaiah sat back in his chair, the weight of it pressing on him. This wasn't just one bad flight. It was systemic, deliberate, and far uglier than anyone had admitted. His jaw tightened as he looked up at Julian. "Get this to Marianne, and prepare a statement. The world needs to see this." The firestorm that followed would make everything before it looked like a spark. The leak broke just before dawn. By the time Isaiah Cole awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing relentlessly, every major outlet in the country had already picked it up. Internal airline memos reveal passenger profiling policy. The documents were damning phrases like low-priority service flag, undesirable passengers, and profile categories subject to crew discretion were splashed across headlines. The subtext was impossible to ignore. Discrimination had been institutionalized, hidden beneath coded language and buried policies. Isaiah sat at his kitchen table, a cup of tea steaming gently in his hands, while Julian paced nearby, reading updates from his tablet. "It's everywhere," Julian said, his voice tense. "CNN, The Times, even international outlets. Hashtags are exploding. Profilegate. End the flags. Dignity protocol." He looked up. "They're going to deny it." "You know." Isaiah nodded slowly. "Of course they will. But the truth has a way of making denial look like arrogance." By mid-morning, Continental Atlantic called an emergency press briefing. Jonathan Reeves stood grim-faced at the podium, cameras trained on him. "The documents reported today do not reflect our company's values," he said, voice steady but unconvincing. "We are launching an internal investigation to determine their authenticity." Isaiah watched the live stream from his office, lips pressed thin. He knew Reeves was cornered. He wasn't the architect of those policies, but his leadership now tied him to them. The real architects were men like Richard Hale, who even now was likely scrambling behind closed doors to protect himself. Sure enough, Hale and Leland convened a private meeting with legal counsel. "We cannot allow Cole to dictate the narrative," Hale snarled, sweat beading at his temples. "If we lose control of this, the board will gut us. Reeves will sell us out to save his skin." Leland, ever cautious, whispered, "Then maybe we sacrifice him first." Across the country, ordinary people were not waiting for investigations. Stories poured out by the thousands. Passengers of color, immigrants, disabled travelers, all recounting moments when they felt invisible, less than, or outright devalued. The leaked memos gave those memories legitimacy, proof that what they felt wasn't imagined, it was policy. That evening, Isaiah appeared on a primetime news special. The anchor leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Mr. Cole, these documents show systemic discrimination. What do you say to those who argue this is about bad apples, not a rotten tree?" Isaiah's gaze was calm, deliberate. "When an apple spoils, you don't blame the tree. But when entire baskets spoil, you ask who's running the orchard. These memos show intent. They show culture. This isn't about one flight attendant or one manager. It's about a system that rewarded dismissal and called it efficiency. That system must end." The clip spread like wildfire, his words quoted in headlines, printed on protest posters, even painted across murals in city streets. Isaiah's quiet authority carried more weight than the airline's entire PR machine, but with the momentum came danger. Late one night, Julian handed Isaiah an envelope that had been slid under the office door. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Walk away, or you'll regret it." There was no signature, no return address. Isaiah read it once, then calmly folded it and set it aside. "Fear," he murmured. "It's their last weapon when power slips." Julian looked uneasy. "We should call security." Isaiah shook his head. "We don't silence threats by hiding. We silence them by standing taller." The next twist came 2 days later. Marianne Torres, the FAA investigator, requested an urgent meeting. In a quiet government office, she laid another folder on the table. "Isaiah," she said gravely, "the leak doesn't just implicate Continental Atlantic. We found evidence other airlines use similar profiling systems, sometimes sharing data between carriers. This isn't one company, it's the industry." Isaiah leaned back, stunned but not surprised. "So this isn't a battle," he said softly. "It's a war." Marianne nodded. "Congress is calling hearings. They want you to testify. You'll be under oath, under lights, every word dissected. The industry will paint you as dangerous. Are you ready for that?" Isaiah looked out the window, the city lights flickering below. His father's memory surfaced again. that quiet humiliation from decades past. He thought of Ruth Johnson, the retired teacher who cried watching his speech. He thought of Linda Moore, who had spoken up on that flight. He thought of the countless letters he'd read, each one a wound waiting for acknowledgement. He turned back to Mary Ann, his voice steady. "I've been ready my whole life." That night, Isaiah sat alone in his study, pen in hand, drafting the words he would deliver before Congress. He thought about tone firm but not angry, passionate but not reckless. He wanted every listener, from the most cynical senator to the most ordinary citizen, to hear the truth not as a corporate scandal, but as a human plea. Julian entered quietly, placing a fresh cup of tea on the desk. "You don't have to do this alone," he said. Isaiah offered a faint smile. "I know. But the words have to start with me." The marble halls of Capitol Hill echoed with the shuffle of shoes and the low murmur of voices. It was a bright morning in Washington, but inside the committee chamber the air was heavy, charged with expectation. Reporters lined the back rows. Cameras were perched on every shoulder, and senators sat at the long mahogany table like judges presiding over history. Isaiah Cole entered quietly, flanked by Julian and Mary Ann Torres. He wore a dark suit, his tie perfectly knotted, his expression calm. But inside, his heart pounded with the weight of generations. As he approached the witness table, he glanced at the crowd. He saw Linda Moore sitting in the public gallery, her hands folded tightly in her lap. He saw Ruth Johnson, flown in by activists, her presence a quiet reminder of all the untold stories. The chairman banged the gavel. "This hearing of the Senate Committee on Transportation will come to order. Today, we address recent revelations of discriminatory profiling practices within the airline industry. Mr. Cole, you may begin." Isaiah adjusted the microphone, his voice steady. "Thank you. Chairman, senators, ladies and gentlemen, I am not here today as a CEO. I am here as a passenger who asked for a cup of tea and was given a reminder that dignity, for some, is treated as optional. What happened to me aboard Flight 2117 was humiliating. Yes, but the memos you now hold in your hands show something far worse, that humiliation was designed into the system, that millions of passengers have been subjected to quiet, invisible categories that determined how much respect they received at 30,000 feet. A senator leaned forward, skeptical. "Mr. Cole, some argue this was an isolated policy, a mistake by a few individuals. Isn't it an exaggeration to claim the entire industry is complicit?" Isaiah met the senator's gaze without flinching. "Senator, when multiple airlines share data to decide who deserves to be treated as a priority and who does not, that is not a mistake. That is collusion. When you create codes that reduce a human being to low priority, you strip them of their dignity before they even sit down. If you think that is isolated, then you are not listening to the stories of the people who fill your inbox every day." The gallery stirred, a ripple of agreement passing through the crowd. Linda's eyes brimmed with tears. Ruth clasped her hands tighter. Another senator, older, leaned back in his chair. "Mr. Cole, you've become the face of this movement, but critics say you are motivated by personal gain, leveraging outrage for influence. How do you respond?" Isaiah's tone softened, but his words carried weight. "I already had influence. Senator, I already had power. If I wanted more money, more leverage, I would have stayed silent. Silence is profitable. But silence also means my father's humiliation on a flight 30 years ago remains invisible. It means Ruth Johnson here would keep her pain to herself. It means my own children would one day inherit a world where a seat on a plane is a measure of worth. I do not want that. So no, this is not about gain. It is about loss, the loss of basic respect we've allowed to persist far too long. The room was still, the truth sinking into the wood-paneled walls. Marianne passed him a document. Isaiah held it up. This is the Dignity Protocol, already adopted by Continental Atlantic Airlines. It calls for independent oversight, transparent reporting, and accountability measures. I urge you not just to support it, but to legislate it. Make it the law of the skies. Because rights should not depend on the goodwill of corporations. They should be guaranteed. Applause erupted from the gallery until the chairman banged the gavel again. Order, order. But even as the room quieted, the momentum was undeniable. Outside the chamber, the reaction was immediate. Cable news broadcast his testimony live. Hashtags surged again. Dignity Protocol, now trending in every major city. Commentators compared the moment to historic hearings on civil rights and consumer protections. In airports across the nation, passengers began quoting Isaiah's words to staff. Dignity is not optional. Yet even in triumph, Isaiah felt the weight of what was to come. Late that evening, as he walked alone near the Lincoln Memorial, the quiet of the reflecting pool surrounding him, he allowed himself a rare pause. He thought of his father again, that silent pain that had shaped so much of his path. He whispered into the night air, I carried your fight here. Dad, I hope I carried it well. Julian approached from behind, hesitant. They're calling you a hero on TV, he said gently. Isaiah gave a faint smile. Heroes are for fairy tales. Julian, I'm just a man who refused to stay seated. He looked at the memorial, its columns glowing in the evening light. But maybe, if people believe in the idea, that's enough. In the weeks that followed, Congress moved with surprising speed. A bipartisan coalition introduced the Passenger Dignity Act, modeled on Isaiah's protocol. Airlines, under pressure from both lawmakers and the public, began dismantling profiling systems, announcing sweeping reforms. Executives who had hidden behind denials quietly resigned. Richard Hale, once defiant, was forced to testify, his reputation in tatters. For Isaiah, the work continued. He chaired the new advisory council alongside Linda Moore, bringing in voices from all walks of life, retirees, students, single parents, veterans. Ruth Johnson spoke at the first meeting, her voice trembling but proud. For years, I thought my story didn't matter. Today, I know it does. As the council adjourned, Isaiah lingered in the room, watching the sunlight spill across the long table. For the first time in weeks, he felt something lighter than resolve. He felt hope, because the message had taken root, not just in policies and laws, but in hearts, on flights across the country. Small changes began to appear, crew members listening more attentively, apologies offered more sincerely, passengers treating one another with unexpected kindness. No system transformed overnight, but the shift was there, undeniable, like the first warm breeze of spring after a long, hard winter. And as Isaiah boarded a plane one quiet evening, this time greeted with a respectful nod and the simple question, "Would you like tea, sir?" He smiled, not because the world was fixed, but because it was moving. And movement, he knew, was how revolutions began. The story of Isaiah Cole is not simply about tea, or even about flying first class. It is about dignity, the quiet expectation that every human being deserves respect, regardless of wealth, race, or status. For many older viewer, this lesson may resonate deeply, because we have lived long enough to know that the small humiliations we endure often leave the deepest scars. What Isaiah teaches us is that silence protects no one. Speaking up is not always about anger. It can also be about clarity, about refusing to let injustice pass as normal. His stand reminds us that every action, no matter how small, can ripple outward into real change. Even a denied cup of tea can become the seed of reform if one has the courage to confront it. In our own lives, we can remember this: to treat each person with dignity costs nothing, but the absence of it can cost society everything. Respect, once given freely, multiplies, and when withheld, it divides. Isaiah's story reminds us to choose the better path, not just for ourselves, but for those who come after us. Thank you so much for watching and sharing this journey with us. Stories like these remind us of the power of respect, courage, and change, and your support makes it possible to keep telling them. If this story touched you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Together, we can spread these voices further and create the change we all hope to see.